Well, hello, everybody here from London. I hope you are all well wherever you are located. Welcome to this DDEX webinar, which is going to focus on allowed value sets. As you will see during this webinar, the use of allowed values is a very important part of the way DDEX creates its standard messages, and in many ways is one of the reasons why the structures that we use are so flexible and can be used and expanded to be used in lots of different ways. My name is Mark Isherwood, and I'm here with my colleague from the DDEX Secretariat, Niels Rump. And we're going to split the webinar with me giving you a brief overview of DDEX. It will be brief because I'm assuming these days most people know what DDEX is and roughly what it does. And then I'll talk a little bit about what allowed values are and why we need them in the context, not just of DDEX, but generally. And then Niels will look at the way in which DDEX uses allowed value sets, both in our standards using XML and also in our flat file standards, to give you an indication of just how important they are to the way in which our messages get constructed. You are encouraged to ask questions in the chat, and we will obviously try to pick those up as we go along, or we will deal with them at the end, depending on the nature of the question and how things are going. So, as most of you probably know, DDEX is a standards organization, and our focus is on improving the flow of data along the music industry value chain to create more efficient and cost-effective communication of that data. And we do this in three ways. Firstly, and probably what people know DDEX best for, we create standard formats, standard computer messages. And what those do is to set out the fields and the order of the fields within a message, and how those fields and the data items that will be populated in them are related to each other, so that when a person or a company receives a DDEX message, they know exactly what information is being communicated to them. The second area that we standardize is what we call choreographies. And simply put, this is defining the triggers that determine when certain messages have to be sent by a particular business partner, and the order in which all of that takes place. And then finally, we develop the actual message protocols, which are the mechanisms by which the messages actually get exchanged within the choreographies. Up until the last 5 years or so, that has primarily been using secure FTP, where we have standardized things like the directory structures and naming convention, file naming conventions. But increasingly, the industry is moving to exchanging data using web services, which is much, much more automated than secure FTPs. And more of the standards you will find the message protocols will include web service definitions that encourage more automation and less human intervention in the exchange of messages and the data that they contain. We believe DDEX is pretty ubiquitous on a global basis. We have issued well over 6,500 implementation licenses. Unfortunately, although we know that most of our, or certainly all of our members to some extent have implemented the one or more of the DDEX standards, and we know that to be true of thousands of other companies, we don't actually have precise implementation data. But we do know that if you want to be a serious player in the music industry these days, then to some degree or another, you will need to use one or more of the DDEX standards in order to participate in the industry. This is a tube map that tries to show which standards we have and who would actually normally be exchanging them. And whilst this looks pretty complex, what we've done over the years is to create standards that meet the requirements of a specific business transaction between two types of entities within the music industry value chain. And although it looks quite complex, it is relatively straightforward, particularly as we use many of the same building blocks when we actually create the different standards. So there are significant commonalities between the different standards, even though they aren't exactly the same. And what underpins that is the data dictionary, DDEX's data dictionary. We call it the lingua franca, and to some extent, DDEX is a language. If you don't speak DDEX, you're going to struggle on a lot of occasions to speak, metaphorically, of course, to your business partners. And the data dictionary contains all of the semantics of all of the terms and tags within all of the standards and the allowed values, as we will see later in this webinar, and the syntax of the messages and the composites. The composites is the term that we give to some of the building blocks that I mentioned earlier on. So, for example, DDEX has a particular way of describing a sound recording or a musical work or a deal, describing the elements of a contract, or a party, contributors to a particular sound recording. And these composites are very much the building blocks that exist, and you will see across all of our different standards. And they may be grouped in slightly different ways depending on the nature of the business transaction that is taking place and the standard that has been created to deal with it. And very often, although you can quite easily get lost in it, the data dictionary is sometimes a good place to ferret around and try and see some of the ways in which DDEX links and data items and what the hierarchies are. So that's something you might like to try. So turning to look now at the allowed value sets and the importance of syntax and semantics. There are, despite what science fiction might say, significant differences between human beings and computers. So with a set of instructions like these, hey Francois, you can start to offer Hey Jude for people to download in France on Monday. Human beings can understand that because they are able to think of the words in a context and therefore be able to take action associated with those set of instructions. And the ability to do this is something that's kept us alive a million years ago when there was a saber-toothed tiger around the corner. Computers, on the other hand, can't interpret those strings, not at least without AI, which is very expensive. And so to create automation, there needs to be certainty within the information that is sent to computers, so that two business partners can know that X is telling Y that they are going to allow them to offer music for download in France. So let's sort of break down that those words. So basically, what those words are saying is, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the song Hey Jude. Be better if we actually used identifiers rather than words, because computers don't particularly like words. They much prefer identifiers. We're also talking about when, so it's a specific date, Monday. We're talking about where, so France, and how, which is allowing the music to be downloaded, and what, again, make available to consumers. But as I've said, these are strings which, just left in the order they were in the original phrase, mean nothing to computers. They're just a bunch of letters and have no inherent meaning in terms of computers. And if we are going to improve the efficiency of communication along the music industry value chain, people at the sender and receiver of a message have to have a common understanding of what those bits and bytes actually mean. And the only way we can do that is to define them in a completely unambiguous way. And that brings us back to the data dictionary that I mentioned earlier on, and in particular, allowed value sets. And hopefully that's given a brief understanding of what we're talking about here and why they're important. I'm going to now hand on to Niels to get down into the nitty-gritty of allowed value sets as they get used in the DDEX standards.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning to you all. Thank you very much, Mark, for that for that introduction. So we know that the semantics is important, not just the structure, that we need to be able to define how to describe a sound recording, how to describe a deal, for example, but also all those codes, those allowed values that then give actually meaning to those composites, or can give specific, instill some information into those composites. Now, DDEX makes use of allowed value sets all over the place. We have more than 200 allowed value sets with more than 6,000 individual allowed values. Some of those allowed value sets, they just have 2 or 3 values. Some have literally hundreds of values, depending on the purpose. Most of them, the vast majority, are defined by DDEX. They are defined specifically for the use in the music industry supply and value chain for the specific instances that we deal with. So all of the different standards have their own allowed value sets, but the vast majority of the allowed value sets are actually used across the board. So when an ERN message, that is a product feed from a record company to a DSP, somebody uses the term download, as Mark has briefly talked about, that has exactly the same meaning as when the term is used in a sales and usage report to a music rights society or music publisher. So most terms we as DDEX define with our members, but there are some that we actually inherit. It makes no sense for DDEX to invent its own scheme to identify territories or currencies or languages. Excuse me. Because there are well-defined and good standards for that. ISO has done that for territories, and I've listed some here: Germany, France, US, Thailand, Australia, but also territories that do not exist anymore, like in this case, the former Soviet Union, SUHH. We use the 2, 3, and 4 letter codes for those territories. Actually, just 2 and 4. Currencies: Euro, US dollars, Swiss franc, and Japanese yen, for examples of ISO currencies that we use, similar to the ISO languages. And we also make use of TIS territory codes. Those are territory codes used by the music rights societies, defined through CSAC by the German society GEMA. They're maintaining it on behalf of gamer. But those are the only ones that we really inherit. Otherwise, we define them ourselves. And we've given us some rules on how to do that. The main thing really is that once we've defined a term, we do not delete it. The same applies to entire sets of those terms, those allowed value sets. So once we've defined download, that term will never change in substance. We might augment the definition, make the definition clearer, make it more concise or whatever, but the substance of that term will never change. At least not until we are really confident that nobody is using that term anymore. And for download, well, that is clearly not the case. What we have to do every now and then, though, because the music industry moves forward and new business models show up and certain ways of using music are phased out and are no longer active in the market, we need to deprecate old terms. There is one exception to those rules. When those terms, when ISO or TIS are actually deprecating or removing values from those allowed value sets that they have under their auspices, we follow suit and we just do basically what they do. But our own values, we don't do that. We keep them in the data dictionary perpetually, basically. Now, let's look at one aspect of allowed values that's a little bit tricky in the context of XML. And that's the expression of hierarchies. When we're talking about XML, we're simply having a flat list of values because that's all what XML can do. But just looking at these 5 use types, the use type allowed value set is much longer than just these 5 values. But there you go, I've just printed those 5 out. You have download, you have conditional download, you have kiosk download, you have permanent download, and you have tethered download. Purely from those terms, you realize that 4 of those are what we call specializations of the 5th one. It's not always clear from the term itself that they are parent and child relationship, but in this case, it is pretty clear. As I say, the XML cannot give you the information that one is a child of the other. They're just values. And in the message, you can put conditional download into your message, and the recipient will then know that a message has been made with conditional download in mind. So if you then communicate to your business partner that it's a conditional download, you're asking, for example, a label asks a DSP to offer content as a conditional download. The DSP knows 2 things. They know it's a conditional download, but they also know, by virtue of this being a hierarchy, that it's a download. So depending on the business circumstances, that may be quite helpful information. But how does an implementer, how does a user of the standard, somebody who wants to implement this or want to know which term to use in their message know about this? Well, if we're going to the data dictionary itself, how we get to that, I'll show you in a minute. You see here the entry for the allowed value set use type, as you see at the top there. That's just the beginning of the page. It's much longer than what you see here. And at the bottom there, you see that the entry for download. And it gives you a definition to transfer or release from a service computer to a consumer's computer for later consumption. This allowed value has been, and so forth. There you see this term actually has been deprecated. So here at the bottom, you see that download actually has 4 children, 4 specializations: conditional download, kiosk download, permanent download, and tethered download. So in the data dictionary, you can actually see which term is a specialization of which, and the other way around. If you now click on, for example, kiosk download, you would see that a kiosk download is to download directly from a kiosk to a consumer device. The terms download, well, that's the parent term, obviously, and then kiosk is another defined term. So that actually now it's very clear what kiosk download is. And as you can see from the top screen there, one of its parents or its parent is download. So you have the hierarchical relationship in both directions. Now, in some cases, you may want to communicate not just that something is a download, but you want to provide a specialization, but the specialization is not in the data dictionary because it's a new business model, for example, or a new type of release, a new type of sound recording. So what you do there, or sometimes it's a completely new use type that is not in the data dictionary at all. Well, luckily, what you can do is refine or override an existing allowed value in a message. So here, for example, is carrier type, one of the longer allowed value sets that we have in the standard. And you see that it has two attributes, a namespace and a user-defined value. And it has a long list of values. This is just from 1 to C, and it goes down to Z, obviously. So it's a very, very long list. And you can see there are 20 or different types of CD, specializations of CD. So if we were looking at the AVS carrier type allowed value set, you would see that CD compilation and CD EP and CD EP enhanced and CD extra compilation, they're all specializations of CD in the very much the same way we've just talked about it in the context of download. So how do we now refine or override an allowed value set? Well, first of all, you need to agree a term between the sender and the recipient of the message. The term itself, the string, as well as what it means. And then you can plonk it into this user-defined value attribute. In addition, you would need to make sure that the DPID of the sender or the recipient, one, doesn't really matter which one, is in the namespace attribute. This means to everybody who then sees this term, who actually defined the term, who knows what it means, because just because somebody calls it 1, 2, 3 doesn't mean anything, as Mark has told us. You need to know who defined it. And if it's not in the DDEX data dictionary, you can have a DDEX party ID, and then you can ask that party to tell them, hey, what does 1, 2, 3 mean as a code there? And then if you want to override it, you put the term user-defined into the main tag, or you can put CD in there. And now 1, 2, 3 is a special type of CD that you and your business partner have agreed. It's a great way of keeping the standard flexible while still have the ability to have well-defined semantics in the message. One of these things that this hints at is that the allowed value sets, they move, they change. As I said earlier, we add to them all the time. And that's because the music industry changes with the times, and it adds new things. But actually, we go a bit further than that. Actually, the way in which we handle the allowed value sets in the XML standards is changing or has changed over time. When we started putting XML standards out, started all in 2006, all the standards used actually one common allowed value set XML schema definition file with all the definitions in. Actually, at the very beginning, it was a tree of 3 or 4 files, but in effect, it was one set that was common throughout all of the standards. For reasons I'm not going to bother you with, we had to change that at some stage, and from around 2015 to 2020, every single standard had its own XML schema definition files for the allowed values. So you had the message XSD and you had the AVS XSD, and there was a one-to-one relationship. Not ideal, because That meant that when we would update the allowed value sets, we had to update lots of files, and that's always a dangerous thing. So earlier this year, or rather late last year, we changed this back to the approach that we used to have with one file, one common allowed value set XML schema definition, but with one crucial difference. We can now version it so that you not only know which version of the allowed value sets you're using, but you can also specifically say, I'm using version 55 of it or version 3 of it. And that's quite powerful, because not everybody is able to always ingest the latest sets of allowed values. If my business model is still not encompassing the latest way of distributing music, but DDEX has already added values for a very new business model, well, then maybe I can't deal with that kind of information yet. So I may want to use an older allowed value set. And there's some changes coming your way. I'll talk very briefly about that at the very end. It's not that important. What is important is, though, that when you're looking at the XML schema definition of a DDEX standard, and in this case, I've looked at the radar notification standard version 1.5, as you can see in the top line, that defines which allowed value set you're going to use. And that line there, it says, hey, as part of this, the XML namespace AVS is defined as DDEX.net/XML/allowed value sets. And at the bottom, the message schema file then imports the allowed values and the allowed value sets. That means for you as an implementer that you do not need to do that anymore, because the XML schema has already dealt with the allowed values. All you need to do, and here is a message header, is to say, hey, I want to go to the message notification standard XSD. In this case, the radar notification XSD. This automatically loads the allowed values. What this does in addition is tell the recipient, hey, I'm using version 2 of the allowed value sets. What that means, I'll tell you in a little bit. That's all you need to do to handle the latest version, or in this case, version 2 of the allowed value sets. The latest version is version 2 at the moment. If you want to tell your business partners that you use an older version, well, you just change this orange AVS version ID attribute to number 1 in this case. Well, that's the only option. But in a couple of years' time, when we are at, I don't know, version 7 of the allowed values, you could then pick the older versions that you want to. Each of the AVS XSD files and the location, I'll go back to the XML schema file, is at the bottom arrow there. That's at DDEX.net/XML/allowed value sets/allowed value sets.xsd. If you open this file, you will find this annotation that I showed at the top here on this slide. This gives you the AVS version of the current file, and the latest version at the moment is number 2. And the XSD server contains all old files. So you can, even though the default validation of the XML schema would be to validate it against the latest version of the XML schema, with a little bit of XML magic, you can actually enforce that the server, or that your validation tool, validates the file against the version number 1 XSD file. By the way, in this case, and for the time being, allowed value sets.xsd and allowed value sets _002.xsd, they are bit by bit equal. They're exactly the same file. So as soon we publish version 3, there will be then allowed value sets _003 in there, and allowed value sets without any number will then be the same as number 3, and then later number 4, and so forth. So how does it look on the today on the data dictionary? This is our knowledge base, the primary source for all the standards and frequently asked questions and tips and tricks on how to implement the standards. And on the right-hand side here, you see the data dictionary, as well as a little piece of information which says what is the current latest version, the current version of the allowed value list set. And the current version is 002, and it was issued on the 9th of June 2021. If you then open the data dictionary thingy-me-be there, you see basically 3 blocks there. There's a master index there, which gives you a list of all the terms that we're using. And then we have split the data dictionary into different editions. One edition for each standard, and one edition for each of the different allowed value set versions. Currently, there are 2, obviously. The reason for that is because these 2 can move at different speeds. DDEX can add a new use type, for example, without changing the syntax of any of the messages. But that means we would need to publish a new allowed value set edition, data dictionary and XSD, which we can do. But that means you have to have these 2 sets of data dictionaries available. So let's just follow the story from a message tag to actually its allowed value sets. And I'll just use one here, the Mead artistic style. That's the artistic style. That's just an allowed value set used in the Mead standard. The Mead standard is a standard that allows you to communicate rich metadata about musical works, about sound recordings, about releases. The stuff that doesn't go into an ERN product feed, but that may be very helpful for DSPs to market a release. And maybe you want to say whether a band is a maracha band or a barber quartet or something of that kind, or a brass band. Well, that's the artistic style. So that's the composite. It looks a bit different than the slightly more red data dictionary of earlier. They're the same. This is just an older version. Sorry for that. So there we have a value, and a value or a type is always an indicator that you're dealing with an allowed value set. So let's click on that. And you then end up still in the message allowed data dictionary at the artist type value. At the bottom there, you see that it is based on an allowed value set. And you can also see that you have the same namespace and user-defined value attributes that I told you earlier to allow you to say that something is not a brass band, but it's a 27-piece brass band, for example. I'm pretty sure we don't have a allowed value for that. That's a little bit too specific. But this overriding mechanism allows you to communicate that. But if I want to now know what values of artist types we have, you then have to manually open the AVS data dictionary, at least for now. We may be able to automate that at some stage, but for the time being, it doesn't work like that. If you just have 2 browser windows open, one for the AVS for the structure and one for the allowed value sets, then that's quite easy. At least that is what I do. So let's open the page for artist type. Here it is. And you see all the values there. And there you have your barbershop ensemble, your big band, your brass band. And I'm pretty sure that there is a maracha band somewhere as well. Quite straightforward. And you can see at the top there that it's the AVS data dictionary in version 2, the latest version. So the older version will say version 1. The next one will then say version 3 for obvious reasons. There is one other thing that I just wanted to mention here, and that is always a bit of a contentious issue. DDEX uses human readable allowed values. That makes the XML messages more human readable, though the messages aren't really for human consumption. but it makes debugging things much easier when you want to implement something and those kind of things, because that's done by humans, obviously. But as you can see, like instrument and accompaniment, for example, some of those terms are rather large. Other standards bodies have opted to go for codes 01, 02, 03, and so forth. Much more compact, but less readable. But also, there is no risk if you have these codes of a misinterpretation. Sometimes we use a term that somebody might actually have a connotation, have an idea of what it means, but it actually means something slightly different. So there's always a danger that when you just see a term, that it actually does what you think it does, rather than what the official definition does. And by the way, yes, there are a fair number of terms that are actually have no definitions at the moment. We're working through them and trying to define all of them in the fullness of time. But for the time being, some of the terms have no definition. I said earlier that at the moment, what we're having is one allowed value set for all the standards, versioned, obviously. And they're served from a or they're available for access, for download, either for you to download it and use for implementations, as well as for live implementations from a digital service provider here in London. We are in the process of moving that to an AWS instance, which of course makes it much easier to scale things up and have specific caches all over the globe. That may mean that the location namespaces of new standards may change. That includes the allowed value sets, although the old ones and locations will remain valid, at least for a period of time, something like 2 years or 3 years or something like that. We'll send out details to all of our licensees and members in due course. I don't expect this to happen in the fourth quarter this year, because that's the high tide for the music industry to sell their stuff. Would be a bad idea to do it then. But we are in the process of doing that. So that's allowed value sets in XML. But we also have flat file standards. We have 4 at the moment, as far as if I can count correctly. There is DSR, CDM, radar, and BWARM. That's a nice bit of alphabet soup here. It's the digital sales reporting and the claim detail message. Those are the standards used typically by online retailers, by DSPs, reporting sales and usages of music to music publishers and music rights societies, and sometimes record companies. That's a flat file version. That's a flat file standard because we're basically dealing with tabular data. The same applies to Radar R, which is the recording data and rights reporting standard, which is somewhat similar to DSR, not only in the structure, but also in the purpose. But this now goes to music licensing companies. So that's the collective management organizations for record companies and recording artists. And BWARM, that's the bulk communication of work and recording metadata. That's a standard that has been developed specifically with the US Mechanical Licensing Collective, MLC, in mind. They have a duty to report the content of their database to people who are interested, to certain people who are interested, and that's the standard that is used in that way. That as well is a flat file standard. They all have and make extensive use of allowed values. Well, actually, it's the same allowed values that we've talked about earlier. So the use type that is used in the ERN standard, XML standard, is used in the DSR standard, is used in CDM, in radar. I don't think it's used in BWARM because it just doesn't need it, but there are other allowed values used in BWARM that are used across the XML standards. Yet, they list the allowed values just in a Word document in a table at the end of the standard, or in DSR and CDM, it's a separate part of the standard, whereas in radar and BWARM, it's actually listed in the standard, which is basically a copy-paste job from the data dictionary. Which also means, first of all, it's work to copy-paste it over, and secondly, it cannot be updated. So if there is a new use type, the DSR standard would need to be updated if they want to be able to report that. So in the next versions, we will actually make sure that these standards also use the central allowed value set data dictionary that I've shown you earlier, so that all the benefits of having one set of data dictionaries applies. And in any case, certainly DSR and CDM, they already have the ability to version allowed value sets. Radar and BWARM, they will be augmented to have that when we update that standard for the next time. So that's nothing we're forcing, but as soon as their standards are getting updated, they will also make use of the central allowed value sets. That was what we had prepared. I'm more than happy, or we are more than happy to have any questions and see whether there's anything you would like to discuss.
Does anybody have any questions? If you think of something when we finish that you want to get clarification on, please just email info@ddex.net, and that comes to myself and Niels and indeed others, and we will respond to that. This webinar has been recorded, and in a couple of days it will be up on the main website at DDEX.net under the tab Resources and Press. If you have found this webinar helpful, there are 2 more coming up for the rest of the year. And if you haven't already registered for those, please go again to DDEX.net to the Events tab, and there you can find links to register for the next 2 webinars that we'll be doing during November and December. So I hope you've found this helpful. Thank you very much for attending, and enjoy whatever's left of the rest of your day. Bye-bye for now. Thanks.
Bye.